everyone, and welcome once again to Oh My God on Cambridge Community Access Television. Each week at this time we get together and we talk about God, we talk about faith, we talk about matters of life and death and being and meaning. And I'm here with my good friend Michael Coran. My name is Michael Mack, and tonight I'd like to talk about two people. One that you have most certainly heard of, and one that you may not have heard of. And the two people I'd like to talk about are St. Francis of Assisi and James Twyman, who is a contemporary, who is alive and well and doing very good work. A man who calls himself the Peace Troubadour and has been the Peace Troubadour for well over 20 years, I think. Michael and I yesterday went to see a show of his, a one-man show, at a friend's house, a friend named Vicky Poppy, and I'm not sure how many people were there, but I'm guessing there were maybe 50, upwards of 50, who showed up in that living room to see James Twyman do a one-man show that he has been developing for many years, a show based on the life of St. Francis of Assisi. So I wonder if I might just share a little bit of about the life of St. Francis of Assisi for those who may not be familiar with him, and give us both a little refresher course. St. Francis of Assisi was born in roughly around 1180 something and lived to roughly 1225 or so, lived I think for about 45 years. And was really the founder of the Franciscan order within the Catholic Church, which is an order that has long been associated with environmentalism and with charity. And so he was the founder. And he was an unexpected founder. It was not something that he expected to do, because as a young man raised in Assisi as the son of a very wealthy merchant, silk merchant, he was born to nobility and was expected to follow in that line of nobility and do what young nobles would do. And young nobles were not afraid of having fun. We're not afraid of drinking. We're not afraid of carousing. And so that was the life that he was born into and expected to follow through. I think his dad expected him to follow in the silk business and become a merchant like himself. Francis, at a young age, had a number of encounters with his inner life and his outer life. And what I think was the first encounter that he had with what would ultimately become his life's work was when he was in the market square in Assisi as a young man and helping to sell his father's wares. And a beggar came up to him asking for alms. And Francis's heart went out to this beggar. And I'm not sure what transpired there. Maybe he gave him some alms. Something transpired, because when the beggar left, Francis followed after him. Francis ran after him. And Francis was actually made fun of for behaving so crazily, behaving on behalf of someone of the lower classes. He was reaching below his station as a young nobleman. So I think that was Francis's first encounter with his life to be. He did go on a couple of military adventures. I think that there were, in Italy at the time, there were cities that were at odds with each other, that were warring with each other, and I think that he sided, forgive me for not remembering the names of these towns, but he sided with one of them and ended up in prison for about a year. And that was when he began to wonder if the life that he had been living is maybe not the life that he was called to. I think that he got sick during that time. And it may have been as a part of that sickness that he came to, well, rather be sickened by his old life and wanting to live a new life. He ended up at odds with his father, the wealthy merchant, the one who had actually named him Francesco. His original name was Giovanni, but his father was very much in love with all things French. And I think he had made a lot of sales to the French people. And so he began to call him, when the lad was very young, call him Francesco, to honor that Francophile in him. But he and his father came to odds. And there's one very dramatic moment in Francis's life where, again, I couldn't go into the details. I don't have all the details at my fingertips, but his father and he got into a conflict that was very public. It was in a church, in fact, and Francis was being his father was in effect shaking his finger at him and telling him all the things that were wrong with him. And it was at that time that Francis took all of these clothes, all of these silken clothes, all of these purple robes, and all the other things that a young, wealthy nobleman would be expected to wear, and he took them all off in church, dropped them onto the floor, and walked out naked. And that is where Francis said, well, that's it for me. That's the end of that life, and this is the beginning of a new life. And he started pursuing this greater nobility, this nobility of love, this nobility towards helping those who were really in need, the poor, the beggars, the people all around him. And it was in a tiny church that was falling into ruin that Francis had what may have been, well, it was certainly one of the first mystical experiences that he had that drew him deeper into this calling of love. He was looking at an icon of Jesus. He was looking at an image of Jesus, and the image came to life and spoke to him and said, in effect, Francis, help me rebuild my church. As you can see, it's falling into ruin. And Francis was so inspired by that, he started literally helping to rebuild that little chapel that he was in. So gathering stones from around the countryside to bring and to help literally rebuild that church. And he started gathering followers along the way who recognized his enthusiasm, who recognized his passion, his love, his wild, beautiful, crazy, joyous self. Somewhere along the way, he began to realize that the church that he heard about in that vision was not just that singular church. And so they started branching out to other churches in the area around Assisi and help rebuilding them. And the folks who, typically men, but not always, some women too, St. Clare of Assisi being the most famous, started to follow him, were really drawn to this charismatic character, a character who some have said is more Jesus-like than Jesus, who really lived out this love in all that he did. So, it was then that the order began, that he decided with his fellows, with his brothers, with his friars, and their associated, and the women who also wanted to join them, They wanted to formalize it and make it an order within the Catholic Church, which was the church, the only church for all intents and purposes in the land at the time. So, I'd like to switch now to James Twyman, because this show is really about both of them. So you saw James's show yesterday. Could you say a little bit about the story that he told, or how he told it, how he presented it as, anything that comes to mind?
Well, I think I and other people were moved by his saying he was going to take his story and song.
That James was going to take his story
and song.
and James was singing. James is the Peace Troubadour, and so he has many songs that are modeled on the life of Saint Francis.
So he was going to start in San Francisco
This is his latest adventure, James Twyman.
with no money and aim to travel across the whole country,
Travel across America.
sharing his story and song about St. Francis, and visiting the homeless people in the places and helping them that he goes. So he's going to really be reliving the life of Francis while telling the story and singing about Francis.
And ultimately to end up in New York City, at a church in New York City that is in the Broadway district.
And be doing it there for 2 weeks too.
So I'm gathering that this is a mission that is in process over the next year or so. But I'd like to say just a little bit about my own personal encounter with James Twyman, who I met for the first time back in the early 90s. At the time, he and I were both very interested in A Course in Miracles, and that is kind of what drew us together. He had already been doing his peace ministry. He had been at the Peace Abbey out in western Massachusetts. I think he had been a resident artist or resident musician, something like that, out there. I, at that time, was at, effectively, an ashram out in Wisconsin, and a community of people that were studying the Course in Miracles and trying to find ways to bring it to life and bring it into the world. So I was spending a few weeks out there in Wisconsin, and as the end of my time was coming, I had an offer. Somebody needed to drive a car back from Wisconsin to Boston. And I don't know if it was James's car or somebody else's car, and James was going to use it. I don't remember. But I thought, great, I love driving, and opportunity to see half the country and maybe stop and visit a friend along the way. So I jumped at the opportunity. I'm driving this station wagon back to Boston. Take, I don't know, a week or so to get here, and pull up into, I think it's West Roxbury. I believe it was West Roxbury, to a driveway in West Roxbury. And that is where I think that I met James Twyman for the first time. I may have heard about him, but I believe that that's where I met him for the first time. But certainly it is the first time that he and I had a chance to hang out together for a few hours in an afternoon while I gave him the keys to the car that he was going to use. That's where I learned that he was doing the Peace Abbey thing. That's where I learned about his music ministry. And it was sometime around that time that I went to see him perform a few songs. It might have been also at Vicky's living room. But I remember that he was singing these songs about St. Francis, and that honored this ministry of love of St. Francis's. And I believe he was already calling himself the Peace Troubadour. But clearly peace was his mission. time passes, years go by, he goes off on his adventures, I go off on my adventures, and I don't hear anything about James Twyman for many years. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein is starting to do some saber rattling in Iraq, and in response, George Bush Sr. is doing some saber rattling here in the United States, and now there's this buildup towards war. I am in my tiny apartment in Central Square, Cambridge, one morning, washing the dishes, listening to NPR, and the BBC NewsHour is on. And I hear, right after this news item about the buildup of the Gulf War, I hear about this guy who showed up effectively at the doorstep of Saddam Hussein with his guitar, wanting to sing peace music to him, and did it. This guy named James Twyman. It's like, James Twyman? I know that guy! And I am riveted to the radio, listening to, and so he was interviewed for that. And he was talking about he wanted to sing the songs of St. Francis in the hope of bringing something, some measure of peace in this buildup of war. And I thought to myself, that guy is ballsy. That guy's got guts. Never forgot that. Never forgot it. We did go on to a war with Iraq, and we went on to another war with Iraq, and we all know what came out of that. But it was yesterday. Do you remember that moment in the story of St. Francis where James talked about how he had gone to the Sultan of Egypt,
Yes,
who was at war with the Christians?
Yes, you reminded me of that after, yes.
And St. Francis was inspired to go with one of his friars, one of his brothers, to go meet the Sultan of Egypt and beg for peace, ask for peace, and try to convert him to Francis's faith. They were there for a few days. Oh, and they said, we're either going to do this or we're going to go out as martyrs. Just one or the other. Live or die. And the Sultan apparently was very taken with this little man, with this enthusiastic and lovable little man. And they stayed for a few days, he and his brother friar. Stayed for a few days and ultimately went back with safe passage where they came from. I do not know, historically, whether war was averted or not. What I did hear, this is just today on Wikipedia, I saw that there is at least legend that the Sultan of Egypt, on his deathbed, many years later, converted, inspired by the life of St. Francis.
Wow.
Anyway, I could not help but think of the parallels and think about James Twyman, who really has been living a life modeled after St. Francis in so many ways. I couldn't help but think was like, well, Francis showed us how to do it, you know, how to gird your loins and go up to the Sultan and press for peace. Press for peace. So James has gone on to many other adventures. He was in Sarajevo, I think, Yugoslavia, during the troubles there. But he has really been pursuing this ministry of peace. And I just, you know, I got to tip my hat to the guy as someone who has really been living his calling. I'll do a little publicity pitch. I think it's jamestwyman.com. Probably. If you do a Google search on James Twyman, it'll come up. Anyway, I was hoping that you and I and James would get a moment to talk afterwards, but you and I had to dash off to other commitments that we had already had in place for some weeks, so missed that opportunity. But both of them, remarkable guys, and I just want to tip my hat. Tip my hat. What do you think, man?
I love your appreciation of Twyman and Francis. It helps me appreciate them more.
Francis didn't live a long life. He lived to roughly the age of 45.
Wow.
And I believe that it was a combination of blindness and some kind of illness that took him out. I mean, that was back in the days when people didn't live very long anyway. But there was something that happened in the last year or two of Francis's life, where he had this ecstatic experience and received the stigmata of Christ. So he received the wounds of Jesus in both of his palms, in both of his feet, and in his side, I believe. And I believe that he carried those with him for that remaining year or two.
Wow. Now, what good does that do?
What good does it do?
I would imagine it does.
Well, you could ask that in two ways. What good does it do for the person who receives it?
Yes.
What good does it do to the community around them?
Yes.
Let's try and answer both. I would say that for the person who received it, and I'm just guessing because I haven't received them myself, Padre Pio, Saint Padre Pio now, who was a saint of the last century, he received the stigmata. I imagine that to receive the wounds of Christ is to know that on some important level, in some important way, that you are bound to the life of Christ. That you have been touched by this life so profoundly, by the life of Christ so profoundly, that your body can't help but reveal it. And I think that for the community around somebody receiving the stigmata, it's complicated. Because some people see it and think that there's something fake about it, and other people see it as a mark of authenticity. So the only thing that I can say for sure is that to know on some level the sufferings of Christ, or the sufferings of anyone in your own body, is to be bound to that person, is to be connected to that person in a living and profound way. So we have, amazingly, only about a minute left. Let me do a little summary, and we'll do a little shameless self-promotion of our own work. Anyway, that is my tip of the hat to James Twyman, and of course, to our beloved Saint Francis of Assisi. May they both live long and prosper in our hearts and minds. You can find out more about my work, Michael Mack, at michaelmacklive.com, and my own ministry of healing, my own little attempt to heal the church. And you can find out more about my beloved friend Michael Coran. Where? How can we find out more about you?
I have shows on YouTube.
If you do a Google search on YouTube, Michael Coran,
Yes.
that'll do it.
Or from 6:30 to 7:30.
Right here and right now.
every-
We have 5 seconds. So let's say goodbye. Thank you for joining us. See you next time. God bless.